everyone. This is an audio recording of my interview with Army Ranger Tom Amenta, a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, and my conversation with him. It took me a while to get this audio together due to some technical difficulties at the end of the video, as well as some issues with converting the audio to MP3. So if you enjoy this, please share it around and let me know what you think. Thanks again for listening and have a nice day. So I'm here sitting with Tom Amenta, a veteran of the war in Afghanistan and an Army veteran in the Army Rangers. Thank you for joining me, Tom. How you doing?
Doing good, buddy. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. So I just thought I'd start off pretty simple rather than just jumping into everything because Lord knows that can get a bit overwhelming. So I wanted to talk about how you started off ending up joining the military. I know looking into your history through your website and through some of your interviews, you joined when you were 18 against your family's wishes as well, according to the website that you had. And I was wondering what motivated you to go into the military, and then what motivated you to want to join the Army Rangers specifically?
So I guess I have to be fair to our mutual side of the family, in the fact that our grandfather and our great uncle did not really have a problem with it. It was everybody else in the family. My parents certainly did not want me to do that, and then grandma and grandpa on my dad's side of the family vociferously did not. But I feel like we'll tell that tale and we'll set that up. No, they were generally okay with it, and actually, it was. Our recently deceased, may he rest in peace, great uncle Ralph, who actually got me into the Rangers. I asked, he was in Vietnam and he was in a special operations unit, and I asked him, like, Uncle Ralph, I'm like, what do I do? He's like, well, Tommy, what do you want to do? So I want to jump out of airplanes. I want to shoot automatic weapons. I want to blow stuff up, sir. And he's like, well, then you need to go be an Army Ranger. And so on my 18th birthday in 1999. I raised my right hand and I enlisted for an 11 X-ray 11 40 series contract, which was to be in the infantry and to try out for the 75th Ranger Regiment, which is the United States Army's premier special operations raid force. I made it there, and then actually 1 year to the day that I enlisted was my first day in 2nd Ranger Battalion. So it took me exactly 1 year to get there, but that was how I did it.
Like I've heard stories like that before, but it's always interesting to see that like people connect not only with those who are trying to get them in, but also with people that have already been in units or have experience with it. And I was wondering, what role did obviously the familial element play, but what role did seeing other people in this kind of environment play in your understanding of your service?
Oh man, I just watched war movies as a teenager and wanted, because it was 1999 when I enlisted. So 9/11 had not happened. The United States hadn't been really in a conflict since Gulf War One in the early 90s, and that was junior high. Somalia happened, when I was in junior high, things like that. So, so for me, it was, I'm the oldest of four. I wanted a little bit of adventure. I wanted some college money. I certainly wasn't ready to go to college. I was going to screw that up. So, that was what I was there to do. It was to grow up a little bit, get a little bit of adventure, get money to pay for school. Those were really my motivations. And then, I'm the be all you can be generation for the Army, commercials and stuff like that. And I don't know how the marketing hits with the kids these days, but that was awesome. And so it was kind of a combination of all those things where I was like, yeah, let's do it.
It's actually really interesting that you brought up 9/11 as well, because for a lot of people, more younger soldiers, 9/11 or the memory of 9/11 has played a role in that. So since you've probably served with a lot of people who were motivated by 9/11 to get involved, what differences did you see between, say, your perspective and those who joined because of 9/11?
So I actually wasn't I'll take it a step further back. I actually wasn't in the United States when 9/11 happened. I was on a training mission. Actually, the Stein right over my shoulder, you can see right there. That's in commemoration of Operation Centurion Crusader in Germany, which is where I was when it happened. I didn't actually see the towers fall until a week after it happened because we were in the middle of a training exercise. So And that was the worst. You get a bunch of, you get 200 dudes that are all sweaty, tired, angry, know that they're going to war, but hadn't seen why. And I mean, frankly, like, the world had been so desensitized. So we look up at CNN a week after it, and all we do is see that plane smashing into the second tower over and over. And like, it was on like a 10-second loop on CNN International. And so we were like, oh, we're gonna go do this. Like, someone just stepped up to the U.S. in a really cowardly way, and now we're gonna go even the score. And you definitely saw the first wave of those men and women come through. I went to my first combat tour was started very early March of 2002. By the time I got back from that, you were starting to see like the early edge people really sort of filter in to the infantry and the combat arms. I hurt my shoulder, and I went and worked staff starting January 2003. So I watched that pipeline come through, people who were trying to get into the Ranger Regiment, because I was at regimental headquarters. I used to grade their PT tests. And so at least for that first 2 years, these were people that had they were there to go try and right a wrong. Right. When I was in the National Guard from 2004 till 2013, you sort of saw an evolution away from that. Like, people still knew they were going to go to war. They still were willing to accept the nation's call for that, but it wasn't as personal. It wasn't the stories of I was at place X when 9/11 happened certainly went away. Whereas, from, called the back end of 2002, certainly through 05, 06, that was a really large driving motivating factor for people.
Yeah, and my I've noticed that there seems to be almost a generational divide, perhaps even along multi-generational divides in some cases, where you see people who, like yourself, saw this. Even though it was later, you still had this very strong effect. Versus, say, younger people like my age who may be serving, and don't feel the same way or experience it in a different way. And I was wondering, have you ever had that interaction, both like outside of your service or just in your daily life, or have you noticed it in the way some people who are on leave or things like that talk about their experiences?
I mean, so I think that you have to take the recognition that the United States was at war for 20 years. It was the longest continuous war that the U.S. ever had, and less than 1% of the American population, according to the Department of Veterans Affairs, served in it. So right there, you have this hyper minority of the American population that has done this job over the past 20 years. So I think that before you even get to the generations and you get to the generational motivations, we have to acknowledge that there's this incredibly small group of people that have accepted this burden. Also, the other thing is that well over 70% of all enlistments are all people who join the military are first term and one and done enlistments. So they just do their 2 to 6 years and then they get out. So you have a lot, and over that 20 years, you have a lot of sort of people that got on the train and got off the train, at fixed points, which creates this sort of, I guess, narrative of, that starts off with where were you and when did you serve is going to really color sort of how you saw things. Also, what units you were in and what your experience was. I mean, people ask me all the time, it's like, how did you feel about going to Afghanistan? I'm like, man, we were pissed. When we knew exactly who we were going after, and all we wanted to do was put a bullet through Osama bin Laden's head. Like, that was it. Like, it was 2002, 2004, we were going after UBL. That was it. In Afghanistan, I never went to Iraq, so I didn't have to deal with that. But then you have people that just went to Iraq, and it's like, well, how do you rectify that? How do you do some of those things? So I think that there's a lot more nuance than just age that goes into it. I would say that, people that enlisted and signed up after May 4th, 2011, which is when Osama bin Laden was killed, I would say that as a trend, there's definitely more of a question of why did we go overseas? Like, what was the purpose for things that we were doing? Because that tied into the wind down of the Iraqi surge meets the spin up of the Afghan surge. But those ultimately turn into policy statements and political questions, and you have, we owned the battle spaces that we were in. That was a consistent thing. Like, if we decided that we were going to go shoot it out with someone, or we were going to go take that over, that wasn't a problem the entire 20 years. but the politics of it, the what are we going to do, the how we're going to try, are we going to, the Bush administration was really like, let's just war hawk it. The Obama administration evolved to more of what you would call a cut the grass, just, trim out middle management, keep it at a reasonable level, meets nation building. The Trump administration was very more war hawk, and you saw it in ISIS. It's like, we're going to just absolutely kill them all. And if a bunch of Russian contractors get in the way along the way, well, they can come get it too, right? The Biden administration is the worst of all of them because they have no plan, or they had no plan, or at least certainly never calculated for the worst case scenario, which, is problematic. But I mean, for 20 years, like all 4 administrations had serious problems with what they were trying to do. And I think that is the, that makes it different. But specific to the service member experience, I mean, if you were combat arms, you went over there, we really didn't have the same problems. Like, we were go take that objective, and we consistently, routinely did.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you brought up how there's, on the one hand, you've got the very, very clear difference in who's serving, and the people who don't really know the full extent of what's going on in terms of the person and human realities of warfare. And then there's also the issue of partisanship, evolving politics, or just differences in opinion from where the Bush administration Republicans were versus the Trump Republicans are today. And I wanted to ask, like, in terms of how your perspective affected you, when you came back, when you left the military, how did that kind of perspective clash with what you saw people saying about the war in Afghanistan when you got back to the United States?
Well, I mean, so I got my degree in political science to focus on international relationships in the Middle and Near East. So I was, I can talk about this as an academic just as easily as I can talk about it as a former soldier, and I keep up on it. So when and you've got to remember, I'm old. I turned 40 this year. So when I went to school in 2004, everyone was talking about it. And for me, it was like, well, there was one point that I got into a very, very public disagreement that by the end of it, the professor was screaming at me in a survey class because he was trying to draw this broad comparison about Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm like, you're wrong. You're taking 2 entirely different conflicts and putting them together, and you're completely incorrect. And he, that literally got me sent to the dean's office, and then his advisor ended up having me do a special project instead of his class. Because I literally I shouldn't have handled it the way that I did, but I mopped the floor with him. I'm like, at one point I called him an idiot. I'm like, you're trying to say that Iraq with Sunni majorities that don't have the tribal identities and have all the oil money are the same thing as an Afghan culture that is inherently based on tribal regions, that you have no understanding of the difference between the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, the Pashto, and I'm like, you're just an idiot. I saying nothing of the Pakistani influence, and he didn't like that. So
yeah.
So, I mean, that was me in college, right? That was just me. I was way more war hawk at that time, mostly because we hadn't gotten bin Laden yet. I didn't want to hear it. My opinion on Iraq has always been much more conflicted. I don't know if I would say there was a reason really to go in the way that it was offered by that administration. You can make, on the backside, you can make a case that it allowed for a level of energy independence through fracking and things like that could be said to serve the national interest. I think it's sort of a really garbage backdoor way to do it. But if you want to make a policy meets collective good argument and you choose to take that position, I mean, it's there, it's viable. I don't agree with it, but when you factor in that a whole bunch of oil dudes were running the White House and running the executive branch, and you look at what happened, and you looked at the fact that up until the Biden administration killed the Keystone Pipeline and has severely reduced fracking, and now somehow thinks OPEC is the solution to our energy needs because it looks cleaner and he can try and position himself as a more green candidate. We were energy independent, and that moves into something that's not the topic of discussion, climate change and things like that, which we can talk, but it's like that was generally speaking sort of a consensus when it was all said and done, is what those administrations were doing. I don't like it, but at least you see when you understand it and you peel back the layers, a level of sort of wherewithal. But Afghanistan was always a much different animal. Afghanistan was always about counterterrorism and insurgency and protecting national interests from terrorist organizations and terror attacks, which for 20 years we did. And that's the thing I would say of any veterans watching like myself. It's like, if you went over there, hold your head high. Don't buy into the political garbage and narrative going on right now, because for 20 years there was nothing like 9/11 that happened. I was really angry when it started, and one of my friends, Claire, was like, in 20 years I got married, I had my children, my father watched his grandson grow up, and we never had to worry about a 9/11 because of you and other veterans. And that's your legacy, not the pullout and what's happening today. And she's right, and that is ultimately what it is. So to me, that's the most important part.
Yeah, and I'm glad you've kind of hit off on a few things, but I am talking about like a legacy and how these events are remembered is kind of important, not just to me but to other historians, because I did write my thesis on the memory of Ella Baker and how that affected her. But I was wondering, like you mentioned earlier, how something is remembered right now is very different from where it'll be, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago, especially when more and more information comes out and we think about this. If you had to guess where you think Americans will see Afghanistan in terms of how they view it, how the war itself and the people involved in it, how do you think that will be perceived, and how do you think the relationship that you and your fellow soldiers had with the people there will also be perceived?
Well, I think history is just that. It's his story. So, the book that we did, The 20-Year War, is meant to try and start the conversation of veterans being able to share their service and their transition experiences in their own words. The last time I was in Afghanistan is going on 16 years ago. So already, like, I'm old by that standard. I get to tell, I look back on it with, I don't want to say revisionist, but, foggy eyes, and, way more in sort of the nuance, way less in the nuance and way more of like sort of the memory. So I think that, history is ultimately narrative shaping. Whether you try and be honest about it or not, where it's like, you look at problems, like what aspect do you focus on in a survey course that's going to be 8 weeks in a college semester, for example, or in education, try and cover 1,000 years of history. Like, what do you hit on? Where do you go? Right? You're already shaping narratives that way. It's something against anyone who's making those choices. It's just that you have to accept that that's the table stakes of anything when you discuss it. So to me, I will be very interested to see who is trying to shape that narrative and why. And it goes back to how small of a population went and served for the duration of something that most Americans forgot about by the end of it. Everyone's talking about this forever war and, we're doing, all these things. Well, there had not been an American who had died in Afghanistan before the 13 that were killed by that ISIS-K suicide bomber. February 2020 was the last American casualty that happened in Afghanistan. In his first speech, when we talk about history and narrating and what that, President Biden comes out 3 other places, talking this nonsense about rising capability of counterterrorism. It's like, okay, you mentioned 3 places. Iraq, we have 2,000 troops there right now. And 3 weeks before he gave that speech, the president of Iraq was in the White House, in the Oval Office, shaking his hand as we were confirming and affirming that we would keep advisors and intelligence assets in the country through past the end of the year when we were supposed to be withdrawn. We have 900 troops in Syria right now, which the president, like 3 days after that speech, was like, oh yeah, we don't have anyone in Syria. And then the Pentagon's like, yeah, we do. 900, same profile, advisors, intelligence, and technical logistical support specialists. We don't know the exact number for the 3rd place, fighting al-Shabaab in the Horn of Africa, but we know that they're there. We know that they exist because of AFRICOM's numbers. They just they weave them inside of the entire Africa mission as a whole. So one of the things I will be fascinated, and I hope I get to help shape this narrative, because I'm going to continue to just hammer the president for this, is that he had a consistent counterterrorism policy except for Afghanistan. The decision was made we were going to leave. Frankly, at this point, for what? For the day? Because it was going to be 20 years? Because it was, because somehow that time standard upset him. Like, there's never been a good example of this administration. I'll be fascinated to see how that comes out from people doing the research and getting the interviews and all these other things. And I really hope it's not Bob Woodward trying to write another hatchet job book like he just did and putting Miley in the hot water that he did. I mean, all respect to his All the King's Men turn, but he certainly is not that guy anymore. Again, those are the things that are still there and that are still at play. And I think that it's going to be who shapes those narratives and who gets control of it and who gets access and who writes it, right? And in this increasingly fragmented, short tweet, social media era, I think there's a level of how nuanced that discourse will be, and I think that will be a pretty fascinating thing to watch.
And I'm glad you brought up like how we have all these different perspectives, narratives, ways we think about these kinds of things, especially when you may even have entirely new methods of analyzing history. I mean, for the longest time, the orthodox tradition of interpretation for the Cold War was highly triumphant, highly nationalistic, and somewhat jingoistic, while ignoring all the facets of things that later revisionists ended up pointing out, and then the post-revisionists created some balance on that. But with regards to the distinctions between, like, say, the Biden administration and the Trump administration and how they were handling Afghanistan, I was wondering, what was your opinion on, say, the Trump administration's approach to this? Because on the one hand, you have the Biden administration, which was trying to meet this deadline.
Oh, stop. I hate that. You're the third person I've cut off with this. You want to know what? Here's the problem with that. And this is what drives me so absolutely rip shit about this entire narrative construction if we're talking about history. First, let's start here. The Trump deal was dumb. It was completely and totally stupid. It would be like trying to solve the problems of Middle Eastern peace and only talking to the Palestinians. Okay, let's table stakes this. That was one of the dumbest ideas and one of the dumbest deals in history. And I know people that were talking to the Taliban at that time, okay? No one thought it was a good idea. But here's the rub to it. And here's why I have no time for this administration's narrative, where Blinken, the Secretary of State himself, gets up there and says, we inherited a deadline, not a plan. Bullshit. Let's say you didn't have a plan. Cool story, bro. You're now in charge. Okay? A leader is responsible for what an organization does or fails to accomplish. Period. That is the definition of leadership. And so with this continuing evolution of this narrative and this push, and since we're talking about history, what he's trying to get the history books to represent is patently false. He was in the Oval. He had the opportunity to change that deal at absolutely any time that he wanted to. And instead, he's going to try to blame the idiot, which before him. Now, look, I've got plenty of smoke for the previous administration, and I'd be happy to tell you how much I didn't like what they did. But it's abhorrent, and it's, in my mind, unforgivable to your solution to a problem to blame the other guy when you were in complete control and had absolutely 100% ability to change everything. And he chose not to. That's the fact. He chose not to. He decided he wanted to leave. He literally left Bagram Airfield with General Miller in the middle of the night.
All right.
Middle of the night. No coordination with Afghans, completely hung him out to dry, gave him no logistical support whatsoever. So, look, we'll figure it out eventually. More of that will come out, and that's fine. But this whole narrative that's emerging, this whole notion, I will absolutely speak truth to power and immediately call bullshit to about a deadline. No. You're in charge, my guy. You are the leader of the United States, the leader of the free world. It took 36 hours. 36 hours for him to talk to Boris Johnson over in the UK, our most powerful ally in all of this. It took him roughly the same thing to talk to the president of Canada and the prime minister of Canada and Justin Trudeau. Okay, like this narrative of deadlines and all this other stuff is garbage. He made a decision. He didn't include our allies, and then he tried to blame the previous administration. We had complete autonomy and complete authority to change it. Like, I don't want to hear it. Like, I've said this on CNN. I've said this all over the world, literally. Like, forget it. It's garbage. It's a crap. It is a bad talking point that I don't know why people keep pushing, because he had all the power in the world to change it. He's trying to change the tax structure right now through Congress, right? From 26 to 29.5%. And everyone's like, oh, great, we need that. But he can't change a deadline? That he doesn't need Congress to do that. He can just say he's doing it.
What I was going to say was not so much as it relates to, like, blaming or saying that he had to hold to this deadline. Well, my point was, I was going to ask whether or not you saw a similarity in their thinking about whether or not they had to hold to a specific date, rather than approaching it as a matter of analyzing the strategic structures. I was going to be more focusing on.
I think that both of them were looking at Afghanistan as their own version of publicity stunt, and I think that the difference is that you had a trend line in the Trump administration for all of the things that I'm highly critical of him. The one thing you can say is when Syria started going sideways, he's like, oh no, we are not. This is an unacceptable risk to American national security. He sent in a whole bunch of troops, and they absolutely decimated ISIS. He was trying to do roughly what he wanted to do in Afghanistan. That was pull out, get out of there. ISIS got out of control, and he immediately sent the troops back in. I mean, that's what he did, which, in my opinion, was the right call. There was a serious endangerment to American counterterrorism strategies and American national interests, and he left a smoking hole in the ground. Now, there's other ways he could have done it. If you want to have a nuance of counterterrorism or insurgency strategy, things like that, I mean, let's have the conversation. But he realized he had the humility, which is an incredibly ironic thing to say about Trump, but he did have the humility to go, I made a mistake, and I am not going to make a bigger mistake. And that's something that the Biden administration to date has not shown.
Okay.
I mean, right now, the Interior Ministry of Afghanistan is Sarjar Haqqani. Do you know who Sarjar Haqqani is?
I had his name on here, but I was going to actually ask you a little more to explain that background if you'd like to.
Sarjar Haqqani was considered high-value target number one right after Osama bin Laden died, because he was the head of the Haqqani Network. The Haqqani Network is a known terrorist organization, narco-terrorisms. They are logistics specialists primarily for opium, working in the tribal region of Pakistan, which is semi-autonomous. Okay, they were the largest danger to American forces in the west, east. Or I'm sorry, not the west, not the west, the east, northeast, and central Afghanistan. He still might. I'd be actually interested to find out. I don't know for sure. I haven't found out from my friends there. But at the time of his elevation to the number 3 post in Afghanistan, he had a $10 million bounty on his head from the United States as the leader of this network. His uncle, who is equally a bad dude, who actually started a literal massive fight in the presidential palace in Kabul with Mullah Badr, who was the deputy minister, the number 2 in the organization over what really won the battle, their diplomacy in Doha, or more the Haqqani militants, is the minister of refugees, which is hilarious. That fight got so out of hand that Badr and the more negotiation, diplomacy-minded people fled to Kandahar, which is historically the Taliban stronghold. So, these are the guys that are running the country. And that's the other thing about this, is that we've empowered, but our actions have directly empowered terrorists. ISIS or Al Qaeda and their remnants has come out and publicly said that they believe they will be back to full strength in the national or international press, forget national, in 1 to 2 years. So when it comes, and that's why it just bothers me when it comes to this deadline and it comes this blame on the previous administration. No, dude, you had the opportunity to change these things. You elected not to, and your constant narrative attempt to shape and reshape history is, it was the other guy's fault, completely ignoring that you had the power to change it. And I'm just not here for it.
And I understand your frustration with that. I'm not trying to make any blame on that.
I'm not saying you are. I'm just saying that, we're talking about things in the context of history, right?
Yeah.
And history is really just that, his story, right? And if the story and the narrative that's being shaped is, it was the other guy, it completely avoids and divorces itself from the reality of what the current administration could have chosen to do and elected not to. Okay, then that is an action, and there's always a reaction to an action, and the reaction to that is known terrorists in prominent government positions in the current Taliban administration. It has led to extortion rackets in order for American passport holders to take off. It is further, through their series of decisions, led to Americans being left behind, which violates the absolute core tenet and basic tenet of governance. The basic tenet of governance is that the government will take care of its people. And we have failed as a nation to do that for hundreds of Americans. And I'm not even subsecting their annoying language of Americans who want to leave, which is a whole other conversation that they're being disingenuous at best about. And I say this as someone who's working with the Afghan evac and Digital Dunkirk to get people out of Afghanistan. So I've got plenty of firsthand stories of people that were considering not leaving Afghanistan, and it had nothing to do with their desire to stay and had everything to do with the family members they were worried they would have to leave behind. Which is hyper disingenuous in my opinion. But I'll let's keep this to a historical perspective that you want to. And the fact is that we couldn't even fill our core basic tenet of governance and take care of all of our people. And we still have it. There's still hundreds of Americans that are stuck in Afghanistan right now that we're either going to have to bribe the Taliban, pay money to terrorists, or, some people that are still there are going to have to smuggle them out. I mean, I'm not talking about SIV visas holders anymore. I'm not talking about SIV applicants or green cards. I'm talking about actual passported American citizens. That's abhorrent. That's a failure of epic proportion. That I'm not talking about anyone but American citizens, and that just is incredibly frustrating when you watch what happened and you listen to narratives like, "Oh, it was the other guy's fault." No, it wasn't. It's your fault. It's your fault. You're in charge.
And that's the thing that I think comes with a lot of this foreign policy as it relates to the executive branch's control. A lot of times that political game comes up, like you mentioned earlier, where multiple administrations over a period of time have this perspective where they think, here's my goal, here's what I'm going to do. And in many cases, they don't look at the ground level things that you are mentioning right here. And considering now that a lot of those people are still there, and considering that even for those people who were airlifted out a couple weeks ago, my bad. What would you like to see as the appropriate response from the current administration, and how do you think we should handle not only the people that we currently have in our custody, but those who are not currently in our custody and under our security?
So define in our custody.
Like basically those who are either who were in our airships or airplanes that were taken out of Afghanistan and are currently working their way through the system, either through our allies in Germany or in the UK, or something like that, or versus say somebody who has gotten to a location that is secured by the United States.
Embrace them and help them do everything they can to achieve the American dream. Like, one of the things that bothers me so much about that is that when everyone is asking who are these people, they're our friend. They're my friends. Okay, they're friends of people that I worked with. These are people that saved American lives. These are people that sweat with us, bled with us, cried with us, and it's their families. So there is probably a very small percentage of people that might have snuck through, and in which case the administration seems to have just pushed them through, which is a whole other thing. But check them, confirm them. If you're not 100% sure, if they don't have the paperwork or which, because we told some people at times, burn your paperwork, and you need to biometric them or whatever, like, take your time, get them there. But the overwhelming majority of these people, they just want a better life. They just don't want to die. So, I mean, I say welcome to the United States, welcome to the American dream. You're not going to find a more motivated group of people to succeed because they've got a second chance on life. For everyone who's still stuck in Afghanistan, we are now in a position where if we want to exert influence there, we are going to have to do it by force. And in order to do that by force, it means we need to reestablish military presence there, which would mean basically going all the way back to Objective Rhino in 2001, jumping in and starting to, do things like that. Or pay a whole bunch of extortion money to the Taliban to get these people out, which, by the way, is not going to happen in the Panjshir Valley. They're already getting shot, they're absolutely killing people in the Panjshir. If they find people with American or international phone numbers and things like or specific types of documents, they're killing them. They are selling women into marriages, which is really just sex slavery. Like, all the things that you've heard about before, they're cutting people's hands off. Like, the Taliban's doing what the Taliban did 20 years ago. Okay, like, I don't want to hear about this kind of nicer Taliban. It's not bearing itself out, period. And I've heard the audio files and I've seen the videos. Okay, like, they're not. But in order to influence and affect that, we'd have to go back. Is that worth it? I genuinely don't know. I think that the net upshot is, despite Biden's hubristic, I'm not going to commit a fifth president, there's going to be a terror attack that's going to come out of that country, and it will absolutely rise to the level of us having to go back. And you've got to also go to this horrific policy decision where he identified 4 major areas of our counterterrorism strategy, and 3 of them have troops in them, and the one that doesn't, Afghanistan, is the one that we just left. He had to almost quadruple the number of troops there just to get the 124,000 people that we got out. Like, it's a policy failure. And in order to re-affect and re-engage in that, it would require the humility to admit that it was a foreign policy failure. And I see no designs or intention from this administration to do that, complete with the fact that he's now allowing private NGOs and government contractors, if they can get into Afghanistan, to operate with State Department blessing. He announced that last week. So, I mean, I don't know. I think that you have to sort of let this shake out and let it see what it really is going to be for a little while. I mean, having a battlefield pause is an intelligent thing, especially with the way that this has gone down. But anyone who thinks that this gets solved by anything other than military force at scale is kidding themselves. Like the Taliban, at what point is the Taliban going to put the people in the government that they did, going to fight the way that they fight, are going to kill the people the way they kill, are going to create the rules that they've already created and stated for the world, where we don't believe them? I mean, it's just where we're headed. It's not Tom Amenta's opinion. That's just what they're telling us they're going to do, and that's what they keep telling us that they're going to do.
I remember distinctly when there were reporters when they still hadn't fully taken the Kabul capital. There was a reporter that actually tried to interview one of these fighters, these Al Qaeda terrorists, and she started asking them, would women be allowed to return to their jobs? Would women be allowed to partake in society?
Yep.
And the first thing they did was laugh. Right. And I mean, like, that's the thing I do sometimes wonder about how we respond to this, because on the one hand, a lot of Americans, myself included, have had difficulty answering the question, why were so many of our people there for 20 years? But at the same time, there's a certain disconnect between people like me and people like you who have seen like the brutal hand of it.
Well, I think that there's a disconnect, and I think that this is, when you talk about history and you talk about narrative shaping, one of the things that just floors me is, how long have we been in Germany? How long have we been in Korea? How long have we been in Okinawa, Japan? Right?
We've been there for a long time.
Because so this narrative of, now, if you want to say that it was a more dangerous situation in Iraq right now, or in Syria right now, or the Horn of Africa right now, or Afghanistan right now, like, I understand if you want to talk about, permissive, semi-permissive, non-permissive environments and the risk to troops. I mean, but that's a different conversation from how long we've been there, which is another one of those narratives that I find hilarious, in the sense of, like, we're never leaving Germany, right? I mean, we're never leaving Germany. We've been in, for the longest time, the most American troops, if we weren't in an active war zone, we're in Germany, right? We're not leaving Korea as long as North Korea is still there. Like, we have an active, vested interest, and everyone understands that. We spend billions of dollars there, right? So this concept of Americans being in specific spaces or in harm's way, or why are we there? Like, we have established a policy of that consistently. Like, we're still doing it. So it fascinates me. Like, why? Because one's a nation state and we're worried about Russia, so we're cool with it. But because we don't know who the bad guy is in a counterterror cell, like, it makes us more hesitant. Is it because of the recency bias, because everyone grew up with people in Germany at this point? Like, hey, that's cool. Or Korea, or I don't know, but this whole notion of, oh, well, we're exhibiting this space and we've been there for 20 years. Like, we've been in Germany now since 1940, like 41. I'm sorry. Come on, man. Like, that to me is where you start seeing some of this breakdown. Yeah. We've been there for 60 years. Come on.
Yeah. And I think that is kind of what I'm trying to get at here, is that I think there's a lot of singular perspectives in so much, and like, this is the issue we have to focus on. This is the problem that we got to deal with. And this is the perspective that you have to take, especially in a lot of online political commentary, news, and things like that. And there's very little large-scale considerations in comparison to many of the countries you brought up yourself. I'm just going to have one last question for you, since I may be having some technical difficulties. So sorry if we have to cut this short. But if there was one thing you'd like to advise to people who want to talk about these things a little more, want to be able to try to analyze it from a more nuanced perspective, what would your advice be to them? And how would you like to see people examine conflicts like this in the future?
Oh man. So I think one of the things that I would encourage everyone to do is start reading the Soviet War College assessment when they went to Afghanistan, called "The Bear Went Over the Mountain." Um, because one of the things that's very fair is that we did not learn a lot of lessons that we should have from the Russians. I had that book in my rucksack in 2002. I think that you've got to be able to speak intelligently to who the Taliban are and be able to separate their perversion of Islam from the religion and understand um, how complicated on some levels that country's politics are. You need to be able to understand the tribal ideologies of, you know, um, some of the major players and why that causes because it's so different from American politics. And if you don't understand that, you're not going to understand that country. Um, I think that you also need to understand what the geography is and why, we're not going to crucify, or really crush the Pakistani ISI for airstrikes into Panjshir, and understand the complexity to it. I think that, Steve Cole's Ghost Soldiers, which I believe was released in 2002, is another book that still kind of holds up. And then read long form. Don't read whatever CNN or Fox or MSNBC is putting. Like, find long form content that's from the Atlantic or the New Yorker, through the past 20 years to read about it and read some of the individuals who have been there's stories, because I think that at the end of the day, that's going to give you a better perspective of it and understand that it was always a very complicated situation. And if you don't understand the complexity of what the situation you're facing on the ground, some of this is just never going to make sense. So that's where I would start, and just, there's a lot of, there's a lot of nuance, and there's a lot of, especially if you really wanted to do the work and juxtapose it against Iraq, you start seeing really quickly how they're very, very different conflicts. One was very, very rooted in economics, world economics, power plays for oil and energy and things like that. And how once we sort of figured out how to make those drivers really work, Iraq changed quickly, and how we never quite got Afghanistan right, in large part because we never really understood the culture. And I think that if you want to get a handle on it, that's where you got to start.
All right, well, thank you very much for joining me. You're always welcome back on the show. I really appreciate your perspective, and I'm so glad I had this conversation with you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, buddy. I appreciate it.
No problem. Take care, man.